On today's show, we're going to talk about some very important Supreme Court cases dealing with the sanctity of life, religious freedom, some basic civil liberties you're definitely going to want to watch. It's going to be in the second part of the program. But the first part of the show, I want to talk about something that we've all seen in the news, something very disturbing, and that's the tearing down of statues all across America, statues of people in history, significant people in history. There's been some statues that some people may not like, they may not agree with, but without any authorization of government, on their own, they're destroying, tearing down these statues. I'm going to talk to our guest here on the show, who I'm really glad to be here, the pastor liaison for Pacific Justice Institute, Peter Moore. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Now, Peter, you've noticed what we're dealing with here with these statues being torn down. I understand just recently that University of Wisconsin is thinking about the students there are pushing the administration to tear down a statue of someone very controversial with tremendous vitriol for so many Americans, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln. And so they want to tear down Abraham Lincoln. Tell me, why do they want to tear down Abraham Lincoln?
Well, our 16th president, was not perfect, just like we all aren't perfect. But I think that they're looking at history from the lens of a very selfish paradigm. And,
how's that?
Well, they're not wanting to admit everything that he did to bring right and good to our nation. They're not wanting to admit the end of slavery, the fact that he kept our nation united during a very divided time. They're just wanting to look at all the different flaws. And if we're going to tear down statues for people who are flawed, there will be no statues left.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a good point. There will be no statues left, especially when we're measuring them on today's standards.
Right.
And I think that's what people forget. I mean, is it really fair to measure someone based on the cultural protocol of 100, 200, 500 years ago, based on our enlightenment of where we are today and where we see things and how we see things? It's interesting, if in the future, let's just say hypothetically in the future, that our society changes and say 100 years from now, our society declares that dogs are equal to human beings, and they're entitled to all equal protection and equal rights, and they are enlightened to this. I mean, that's hard for me to picture this, although I love my little dog, okay? But they're enlightened to this, that dogs are totally equal. They're entitled to everything, to voting, that leashes are cruel and just mean and et cetera. I mean, they look at this just horrifically. And they decide to say, well, we found out that presidents, civil rights leaders in the United States today had dogs. They had them on a leash. They take them for a walk. This is barbaric. We should tear down their statues. We take them out of our history books. We should just totally defame them and reject them because they were not enlightened like we are. We would say, well, that's ridiculous. That's your society. That's your culture. That's where you are. You have a basis to judge people in your day by your standards. But that wouldn't be fair. And to do so for us, and yet that's what these leftist extremist ideologues, I get all kinds of caricatures I can have, but I'm not going to do, but just ideologues are having, it's with regards to statues of people who've accomplished tremendous things in our history, like George Washington. His was been defaced a number of times. Yeah. I think one was torn down. Yeah. And they're even going after statues of Jesus.
Yeah, they are.
Now, what's their thinking there? It's because they don't like Jesus and because he was, I understand, he looked too white? The statues made him look too white? Is that the deal?
Yeah, I think it was one of the Black Lives Matter spokesmen, Sean King, who was trying to get all of the statues and all of the depictions of Jesus being white torn down. And his thought was, Jesus, when he wanted to blend in with his parents, went down to Egypt. He didn't go to Denmark, he said. And I think that that's a dangerous point to be made. But let me back up first and say this. Those who are wanting us to recognize human dignity and the fact that all people are made in the image of God, absolutely. But if we're going to do that, we need to be consistent across the board, which is what I think you were making, the point you were making about being consistent and not just saying, if something in the past happened that we disagree with, we're going to take action into our own hands. For instance, in Wisconsin, there was a statue of Hans Christian Heg. He was a commander in the Union Army who gave his life in the Battle of Chickamauga to defend the right that all men are created equal. He was actually actively helping people be freed from slavery, and yet they're coming in the name of Black Lives Matter, and shouting some of these slurs and really treating him really unfairly.
Why?
Because of the fact that he married into a family who 2 generations prior had owned slaves. How is that his responsibility to know what happened in his wife's parents' family 2 generations removed?
So he should be bigoted and say, female, because something you had no control over, but because your ancestors owned slaves, or your parents, or whatever,
Yeah.
then grandparents, then I'm not going to marry you. I'm above you because of something that other people did. Well, that's unjust on its face.
Right.
First off, I mean,
Yeah.
and then, I mean, the fact is that people change.
Right.
People have convictions. I know from the civil rights movement from the 1950s, 1960s, that people who were in that time, in that era, who thought that desegregation was a bad thing and whatever was, I forget what the rationale thinking was at the time, how they rationalized it.
Yeah.
But as they moved forward, they realized, wow, that was not the right way of thinking.
Right.
So they had a change of heart. They looked at it from a different side, repented, if you will. They said, hey, no, this is not right. We're all created by God. We're all equal value, and we should all be treated with equal dignity.
Right.
Did we just throw them away? No. I mean, a lot of politicians actually were over here, and then they changed, and they realized. And so I think that even Wallace, I mean, who was the man Governor Wallace, who stood at to block minority students from coming into a white school against desegregation, even he turned around, changed his position, and was actually applauded and saluted and supported by the Black community when it came time later in life for him to be running for office and in politics and things like that. So I think it's very hypocritical. I think it's very pharisaical, elitist, self-pious, very almost like they're so critical of others, they're not even looking at themselves with a heart of humility. And a true Christian perspective, in my way I look at things, true Christianity, and this is one thing I love about Christianity, it demands humility. It demands the fact that we recognize we don't have it all together, we're going to make mistakes, and when we do, we recognize it, we apologize for it, we seek forgiveness, and the grace of Christianity allows people to move on. And our society today has nothing to do with that, either in terms of history or people even today.
So if we go look at the Bible, there is a pattern of the Bible telling stories about people who got it wrong in order for us to learn and get it right. For instance, in Genesis 31, a statue, a memorial is raised up, and Jacob calls that memorial Galid, which means a witness. Basically, he was saying, this is a witness of the things I've done wrong. It's also a witness of the things that God has done right through me. So humility looks at the past and does not say it was perfect. Humility looks at the past and learns from it. I want my boys, I want my children to learn from the past, good and bad, and to correct their errors accordingly.
And it's so important to have people in relationships to help us understand our weaknesses, who care for us, who love us. I'll tell you, before I got married, I thought I had everything together. And I get married and I discovered I was a very selfish, very selfish, inconsiderate person in terms of how I did things. I'm still working on it. But that's the importance of that humility, working with others in a relationship, and understanding. Of course, that also requires listening. And what I see in our society today with Antifa and others, they don't want listening. They don't want any kind of discussion or conversation or understanding. They just simply want to silence. They want to vilify, silence, and destroy. Literally. Destroy. Destroy our nation, destroy everything that we have and destroy individuals that they don't agree with, instead of having an intelligent, civil time for debate and discussion where we can work things through. I know Martin Luther King Jr. was a model for listening and communicating and coming together and understanding. I just, sometimes I wonder where we are as a society when we don't have that. Hopefully, we're going to see these statues preserved. I'm glad that President Trump issued his executive order. He's doing everything he can. He's even, I got a kick out of this on Twitter. He put out pictures of people who were attacking, trying to tear down one of the statues. I think it was of President Jackson. And many people see him as one of the greatest presidents, and he wasn't perfect, granted. But they were tearing him down. He has pictures of those people on the Twitter saying, here they are, we want to arrest these people. So it looks like, I think he's doing everything he can at that level, but unless we have it at the local level, unless we have governors and specifically mayors of cities like Chicago, Seattle, mayor of Washington, D.C., and other places across the country, unless we have these mayors willing to step up and say, this is not lawful. No one is above the law. We have equal treatment and equal protection under the law, and if you violate a statute, if you tear one down and it doesn't belong to you and it's not on your property, that is a felon, and you're going to be prosecuted, and you're going to be prosecuted swiftly and to the fullest extent under the law. And I think that's what we need in our country, and voters need to hold these politicians accountable. And then those politicians in Congress that are either silent or running for president, and they're silent, their silence is deafening. Deafening. You know, why Joe Biden doesn't speak out against this? Why? It's a no-brainer. No one in office with any integrity and character anyone should be put into office that doesn't have the integrity and character to call out things that are destructive and harmful to this nation, and that they know it. And I find that disturbing. I also find it with people in the House of Representatives, politicians in the Senate. So people need to hold these people accountable. If they're not coming out against these actions and this vandalism and this violence and this rioting, and particularly the tearing down of the statues, there's a problem. If they want us to be supportive of peaceful demonstrations with the messaging they believe in, that's their right to do so. And we at Pacific Justice will defend that right for free speech. But I know if you can't tell, I'm a little miffed by this. So anyway, we'll. What about defunding the police? Let's talk about that now. Defunding the police. I'm trying to get my arms around this. It's like defunding firemen, defunding. I'm just, how do you defund something that is essential for civilization to continue in a civil society?
Well, I've quoted this verse when it comes to religious liberty hundreds of times, but it kind of brings me back to Romans 13, because Romans 13 says, law enforcers carry a sword for a reason. And it says, don't resist them, but engage with them. And I think a lot of people have jumped past reform, have jumped past the conversation like you're talking about, and have jumped right to, well, if we don't like them, or if there's one bad one, remove them. Well, unfortunately, in my profession, not every pastor is worth following or worth being in the pastorate. But it doesn't mean I look at every pastor. I hope no one looks at me and says, well, they're all bad. And so police officers, there might be a bad one, and there might be someone who does something, but we can't throw all of them. We can't defund all of them because of that. It's really hypocritical to do so.
Yes, there was one that gave me a ticket once. No, I'm just I'm joking. Well, they did give me a ticket, and I deserved it. So
I've been there.
So he was a good police officer. He didn't give me mercy. That's fine. It doesn't have to. But there is I think in our society, an attitude that is permeating, which is implicitly accusing them of what's called systemic racism, which basically means it's massive. They're prejudiced. They're bigoted. And I think that is outrageous, because I don't believe the studies show quite differently to that. For example, last year, the FBI did a full analysis of homicides. And what they found out is there were over 10 million arrests. That's a lot of arrests, over 10 million arrests. Of those 10 million, there were 1,004 fatal shootings by police officers against another party. 1,004. out of over 10 million. Of those 1,004, all of those people in the commission of crime were armed, except just 41. Just 41. So they say, okay, wow, 41 out of over 10 million, but still these were unarmed. Well, almost all of them, few exceptions, they went they went into the wrong apartment, for example. These mistakes happen. But overwhelming majority of those, overwhelming majority were people in the commission of a crime. And law enforcement had good reason to believe that they were armed or had threatened armed or something like that. And of those 41, 19 were Caucasian, 9 were African American. Those numbers are very telling. That overall, we have a fantastic law enforcement. In fact, one study shows that we have the best law enforcement in the world in view of the level of criminal activity and violent crimes that they have to undertake and their degree of professionalism. But we're still going to have occasionally one or two others and people that pop up that do things wrong, like the one in Chicago, for example. That was terrible, absolutely terrible. But then we have to look at something else. Our justice system. What happens to those people, those law enforcement officers who do the wrong thing? They're investigated, and after a thorough investigation, it finds out that they did something wrong, like in Chicago. They're prosecuted aggressively under the law. And we had the case out of Ferguson. That's where he shot the person who allegedly was had his hands up, saying, don't shoot. Reality, they investigated, found out, no, that was not the case. The African-American gentleman in Ferguson actually was charging them without his hands up. That was a big lie. And they found that out through African-American witnesses who validated this. The U.S. Department of Justice got involved. They validated it. Turns out this police officer was well within his duties, was not criminally prosecuted, and he shouldn't have been criminally prosecuted. But what happened in the interim is we had massive rioting because people weren't willing to stand by and step back and say, let's let the system run its course, let an investigation be done, let's find out what actually happened. But instead they vandalized countless numbers of businesses and individuals, mercilessly, and innocent victims under the pretext that somehow they were justified to doing so based on something that had not been investigated, something that they did not know about. They just assumed they wanted to prejudicially and in a bigoted way believe the worst instead of respecting humanity and our system of justice. So I think there's a real problem in many in our society that have it's not an irrational prejudice against law enforcement that hasn't been deserved. Maybe they just have someone in their personal life that's been impacted unjustly. Maybe someone that they love has been criminally prosecuted and they think that maybe they shouldn't have been put behind bars for as long as they were. But I'm thinking the whole concept of defunding the police is the epitome of that what we're talking about here, of injustice, bigotry, discrimination, prejudice, unfounded and unjustifiable against an entire group of people, law enforcement in the United States.
Yeah, it's not wise. And that's the word the Bible uses, is unwise. I think when you back up and you say, is the reduction of police officers going to bring an increase of peace in our communities? And the answer is no. And
well, so why is that?
So on a community level, for instance, in my community, a lot of people say, well, if we have fewer police officers, fewer of these situations will happen. But there's no facts to back that up.
Fewer people will be arrested.
Well, yeah, but
you have fewer police officers to arrest.
Yeah, but the problem is you cannot solve a community issue by decreasing law enforcement. We need greater community involvement and greater police involvement as well at the same time.
At the same time.
You can't reduce one and affect the other.
Right. So programs, which I've heard of quite frequently, actually, where police are learning to engage in the community, police officers going to kids' schools, talking to them, getting to know them, engaging with them.
Right.
That is something I know that in some communities, they had to learn to do that.
Yeah.
Well, and that was a flaw in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they should be a part of the conversation, which kind of goes back to what we were saying. But our church meets in a school, in a public school. And I'm there almost every single day. And, before COVID hit, we were actively, and even right now, actively helping our school district. But I will tell you, if you remove those police officers, which are the first ones to go, the ones that leave the schools, I was there in the Highland shooting in Palmdale. I was right around the corner, and those police officers who were stationed at that school, they saved lives.
Wow.
And I will tell you, those are the first ones to go. We have to keep the police near the schools, in the schools. We have to keep them supported.
In the community,
Yeah,
not far away, waiting for 3 other police cars to back up and then enter the community when something's reported. It's too late.
Exactly. It's way too late.
And yet, they're fearful now. They're afraid if they go in just one police, they're afraid they're going to get ambushed. We have repeated ambushes. People call and say, oh yeah, this is happening. Police car comes in, and then they get massively bullets, flying at them, and officers dead. Last year, and I gave you those stats, we had 41 people, unarmed people, fatally shot by police officers. Okay. 89 police officers died in the process of their job, doing their job just to protect and serve. 89 law enforcement officers were killed. And I don't see any protest, any demonstration of support, if you will, for the tremendous sacrifice. Those retiring from law enforcement in New York City right now, I heard it's 46% above normal. They're leaving. And one of the main reasons they're leaving is because they see a society out there that they're giving their lives for, literally.
Right. Yeah.
And they're sacrificing in major ways.
Right.
And they're having bricks thrown at them. Their lives are being threatened. Society's not appreciative. So they're saying, I'm done.
Yeah.
Because if they don't have community support, it's over. And then what happens, what I'm concerned, is where they're needed the most is in those communities where they're hated the most by urban societies.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen? They said they don't want police. Crime is going to increase. Innocent little children are going to be murdered. We've already seen this happen. We've seen it increase. In Chicago, it's been horrific. Mayor Lightfoot, she came out and she acknowledged. She says, I don't even know how we're going to keep businesses here. That's another thing, economic impact. We're going to have, we know all this rioting and burning down businesses. This is like in inner city areas. Those jobs are going to be gone for decades. It's taken decades to even build up those communities with a lot of government support and help. So I think it's going to be people shooting themselves, communities shooting themselves in the foot, or if not that, then the heart.
Yeah.
Because the fatalities are going to increase, the innocent are going to get killed, and it's because of, I think, a twisted mindset, not looking at the reality of the great work overall the law enforcement is doing. I do want to say one thing in fairness to people who have a critique about law enforcement. I do think that there is a very important need for discussion regarding things that can happen to help build trust, like, for example, wearing body cameras. I think that protects both the police officer, but also protects those who have allegations of being falsely accused. Also prevents those making accusations from being vindicated. I know a professor from, I think it was North Texas State University, she was a minority professor. She was jogging in the middle of the street. I'll never forget this, in the middle of the street. Well, the police officers had their camera on their car. They also had their body cams, I guess, and they approached her and said, ma'am, will you please jog on the side of the street, not in the middle, literally in the middle of the street. It's like she was trying to provoke something. I don't know if she's still a professor there or not. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But so it's all on record, and she came out and she said, I was harassed. They called me, this and that, and they did this, and I was just jogging, minding my own business, and and it was all on video. And then she was exposed. She was trying to create racism. She was trying to foster racism because of her own racist, bigoted attitudes. So this actually protects the innocent. At the same time, it also helps flesh out police officers that should not be police officers. And they're going to happen because we're human beings, and then we need to maintain a justice system that's going to maintain that justice and make sure people are prosecuted and enforced, and have law enforced against them as we all should. No one is above the law. Whether it's Comey, who headed up the FBI, or whether it's a police officer, if they've done something wrong, an investigation has been done, and it validates that they've done something wrong, they need to be prosecuted. And they need to be prosecuted just as severely and just as harshly as everyone else. There should be no get out of jail free just because you have a badge. I mean,
justice is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be principled, and we have to have people who support that and draw those boundaries and blindly, not because of color or because of neighborhoods or whatever, but blindly uphold the law in our communities. We cannot defund them. We can reform them, but we cannot defund them. I mean, that is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it really is. And as we move forward, I'm optimistic that our society will step back, the mainstream of society will step back, think this through logically, see what reforms are necessary to increase trust,
Right.
increase accountability, increase transparency. I think that's fine. The police law enforcement union or association, I was corrected by, they said, no, we're not a union, we're an association. I would say, okay, well, anyway, I'll debate that. But nonetheless, to further accountability, transparency, to further cameras and things, I think those are very positive, very constructive. And I think the mainstream of America will look at that in spite of what we've seen happen and the abuses to law enforcement and the unfair and unjust treatment of law enforcement by our society. And I think that's something we need to do. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to every citizen in our country to not allow violence and rioting prevent us from objectively stepping back and asking the question, is there injustice? Is there the need for reform? And if so, let's move on it and let's do the right thing.
Yeah.
So we have some very exciting things to talk about moving forward. We're going to talk about some Supreme Court cases and a federal district court case that is actually having a major impact on efforts by states and governors to shut down churches unfairly and unlawfully. It's a major breakthrough. We're very excited about this case. We're going to talk about that when we return right after this.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell, and as you know, my passion is to help each and every one of you get the best sleep of your life. That's why I created my new Giza Dreams bed sheets. I started by using the world's best cotton called Giza. It's only grown in a region between the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Nile River. It's ultra soft and breathable, but extremely durable. I guarantee you they'll be the most comfortable sheets you'll ever own.
I do not like my sheets. I love my Giza Dream sheets.
Call or go to mypillow.com right now to take advantage of Mike's limited time offer. Use the promo code on the screen, and when you buy one set of Giza Dream Sheets, Mike will send you another set absolutely free. That's right, buy one set of Giza Dream Sheets and get another set absolutely free. Choose from a variety of colors in solid, stripes, and new flannel sheets. Order now.
For the best night's sleep in the whole wide world, visit mypillow.com.
Welcome back to Brad Dacus Live. I'm Brad Dacus, president of the Pacific Justice Institute, and I'm here with our guest, who's also our pastor liaison, Peter Mord. Peter, thank you for joining us here on the show.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Brad.
Now, Peter, this is a very important case. Now, you're a pastor of a church,
Right.
also. This is a case that impacted churches and religious freedom in a major way in a place, New York, that has been probably one of the most stringent against churches in enforcing shut-ins, if you will, regarding churches and their ability to conduct church services, indoor services, outdoor services, any services at all. This lawsuit was brought, and the court surprised many, this judge, and he decided to rule against the city and against this treatment of churches and say you have to let churches open up. Why did he do that?
Yeah, well, I don't know much about Gary Sharp, who is the name of the district judge who made this ruling, but it had a lot of common sense on it. He basically said you cannot treat protesters one way and churches another, which is what we've been saying, all
Right.
along. But he said you cannot allow, large crowds of protesters and even encourage that, and then come back and enforce on churches the need to only have 25% or 100 people or whatnot.
Whatever was less.
Whatever was less. Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, you've got these I mean, you tell me a church of 30 people, you can only have 7 people.
Right.
You have a church of 5,000, you can only have 100 at the most. And yet, they were giving this acquiescence to all these protesters, and they weren't wearing their masks. A lot of them, some were. A lot of them weren't keeping safe distance. And I know when Mayor Blasio was asked about this, New York City Mayor Blasio, about why are you letting these protesters do their thing without even getting a permit? You're supposed to get a permit to have a demonstration, a rally, which is First Amendment rights to be able to have a rally.
Sure.
But why are you allowing them to do that, and then you're not allowing churches to meet? And he said, well, to paraphrase, he said, well, the message of the protesters is so much more important.
Yeah, well,
What do you think about that as a pastor of a church?
Yeah.
Someone to say, well, people protesting over here on this issue over here, whatever, they can speak, but you can't because your message as a pastor is not as important.
Yeah, the First Amendment is not about, picking and choosing what message we like and then supporting that freedom of speech. The First Amendment's about, supporting freedom of speech for all who would like it. And by the way, the protesters are covered under freedom of speech, but you cannot, then stifle the freedom of speech of churches just because it does not echo the message that you're wanting to send to those in your city or county, even state.
Yeah, and I think free speech is very important to be protected, particularly when we're talking about government actions shutting things down, because that could be done in a very tyrannical way. Some people think it is being done in a tyrannical way as it is, and to deny the ability for people to protest and object to it, I think is very alarming. People should have the ability to protest, be able to express themselves, be able to do so responsibly, to get a permit, so that law enforcement people know that they need to maintain order. There needs to be parameters. This is where you're going to be. This is your protest area. You're not going to block all these streets. You're not going to throw rocks at set fires and do looting. Those kinds of things. I mean, those are reasonable. But the free speech itself, that's protected. Even, in fact, I like the fact that our founding fathers, who, by the way, are being, as we said, criticized tremendously. I'll still quote them. One of the famous quotes, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson, he says, I may not believe in what a man might say, but I'll die for his right to say it.
That's good.
And it's so important we maintain those freedom of speech, but it needs to be maintained for everyone, including churches and pastors. Yeah. And including you. I mean, you want to be able to meet and preach. And right now you're having outdoor services, I understand?
We are. And to quote a founding father as well, Benjamin Franklin was asked, and by the way, this was the most common question when the Declaration of Independence was being written and everything, but they asked, what kind of government do we have? And they all answered about the same way, but it was, a democratic republic only if you'll keep it that way.
Right.
Because if you won't stand up for your freedoms, and if churches don't wave the flag and say, hey, wait a second, like they did in New York, and Pacific Justice just opened up a new office in New York, and Brad, I've never seen anyone more passionate about churches' religious liberties as Pacific Justice and in what you've done in the past. But you step back and you look at what's going on. I mean, there are some countries who have completely eradicated the need for a religious liberty, China and Venezuela and all of that. And we're going in that pathway if we'll just lay down our liberties and say, oh yeah, we won't meet. As long as the government says, that's fine with me.
We'll just do whatever the government says.
Yeah.
That's not what the Constitution's about.
No.
The Constitution's there to keep government in check.
That's right.
And to limit government. It's interesting, the U.S. Constitution is different than the French Constitution. The French Constitution says the government can do whatever it wants unless the French Constitution says they can't. And the United States Constitution is much better, I believe, as a civil rights attorney. Right. It says the United States government can't do anything unless it explicitly has the right to do so under the Constitution. It's so much more sensitive to our rights and freedoms. But you're right, if we're silent and we don't speak up, then we're going to lose our freedoms. I love the fact that this judge looked at these facts and said, when government allows one group to gather and meet and demonstrate, or for whatever purpose, they can't disallow another group simply because it's a different message, different content. Right. It's freedom for one, freedom for all.
Right.
equal treatment, equal protection under the law.
Yep.
And I think that this case is going to have an impact because I know we have cases right now in multiple states, and that is what we're arguing. That you can't allow protesters over here and not allow churches to meet, or you can't allow a movie theater to fill its place with people and then not allow a sanctuary to fill its place with people under the same rules and safety guidelines. It's pretty basic. And so I'm hoping that this decision from New York and this judge's opinion is going to permeate.
Yeah.
And will at the very least have to be taken into consideration when other courts are dealing with the same kind of legal issue. So this is a good thing.
Yeah.
They're not bound by it, but they at least have to consider it by law. And I'm excited about that. We have some other cases I want to talk about now, which is dealing with, for example, abortion. Louisiana passed a law which requires that that physicians in abortion clinics, they have to be admitted to a local hospital in case there's an emergency situation. And with abortions, of course, you have the killing of the unborn, which is murder, plain and simple. But in addition to that, sometimes there are horrific things that happen to women. Not just the fact that they can't have babies because of scarring and scar tissue and things like that, which is a part of the procedure. They're not talked about that risk or explain that risk. But their lives literally can be on the line. Women have died having abortions, unquestionably, and they have had very severe close calls, lots of blood, et cetera. So this law in Louisiana said if you're going to do an abortion, then you need to be admitted to a hospital for emergency procedures so that this woman can be protected. And they have this for other clinics, other kind of clinics. That's the law for all these other kind of clinics. They have to be registered so that their patient can be transferred and treated immediately to a local hospital, that they have the ability to be a part of that process to make sure the patient is taken care of. But Louisiana passes this law, and the United States Supreme Court, under Roberts, 5-4, said it was unconstitutional. And what really gets me about this, Peter, is the fact that the court, in a case almost identical to this out of Texas, ruled 5-4 it was unconstitutional. It was violation, making things uncomfortable, more difficult for women to have an abortion. Okay, but Justice Roberts was in the dissenting opinion. He wrote a strong opinion why that was a wrong decision. Why the law should have been upheld, and then he switches.
Yeah, there's two things that are going on here. Number one, you have the spiritual warfare part of it. I mean, Jeremiah 1:5 says that before I was formed in my mother's womb, God knew me and he had a purpose for me, which is why we say that abortion is murder. It's wrong. The second thing that's going on here is the justices are actually making law, not defending it. And what I mean by that is all the law in Louisiana wanted was just for doctors who had admitting privileges in that area to do the abortions. But now any doctor with any degree can do an abortion. So what it does is it actually makes it a lot more unsafe to have an abortion in Louisiana. And that's what Roberts said last time, that it made it more unsafe in Texas to have an abortion. So it was not a political thing, it was a safety thing. And they just made abortions basically on demand. I mean, you can have anyone. You could have someone come to your house and perform an abortion now because the law was stricken down. It's a very sad thing, and I believe that there will be consequences as a result. We're already getting some of the evidence of the last 3 or 4 years of people who needed to be admitted to a hospital. Well, if the doctor doesn't have admitting privileges, you can't do that.
Right, and it's very, very disturbing. It's illogical. They said, well, there's going to be, instead of 3 abortion clinics, there'll be maybe one, maybe 2, or they'll still be able to have an abortion, which I totally disagree with. Justice Thomas also was very outspoken. He says, let's just reverse Roe versus Wade and get this over with. I mean, he was just so fed up with that decision with so many errors in it. From even people who are pro-abortion, who are academic scholars have been very critical of the rationale and reasoning of Roe versus Wade and not have it brought back to the states. So I think this is very disturbing. Roberts says in one decision in Texas, yes, this is a threat to the health and safety of women. But suddenly he thinks it's okay to have a threat to the health and safety of women in the Louisiana case. I think this goes back to the idea that he's trying to prove that he's not political and that he's stare decisis. He's recognizing this precedent over here out of Texas. But in reality, I see a lack of judicial character, and that he's not willing to stand by what he is on the record of saying is the right thing. He didn't even disagree with what he said before. Right. He just said, because of stare decisis, well, we ruled this way once, we need to continue it. If something is wrong, it needs to be corrected, particularly when it wasn't something that long ago, and when it's something that is people haven't invested and haven't relied upon. Right. So I think that this was very disturbing. Roberts is a loose cannon. He's lacking judicial character, and I think people need to be praying for Justice Roberts, for him to really have the kind of integrity I think that we want, judicial integrity, judicial character that we want. I'm not implicating him personally in any way, but just as he is rolling out these decisions. Now, there was one decision I think it's interesting as well, and it's dealing with his civil rights statute. Right. He decided to expand the Civil Rights Act, 50-year-old statute, and redefine the word sex to mean something totally different. Before, sex meant male, female. Now he's redefined it to mean, well, your self-perception of identity or your sexual orientation, sexual desires. I think was very disturbing, along with Neil Gorsuch as well. What do you think as a citizen, a voter, as a pastor, when you see things like that in our nation heading in that direction in a manner that is not just from a constitutional perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective? Yeah.
Well, I think of Isaiah 28:15 that says, under falsehood, we have hid ourselves. And the false premise that the moral standard that God gives in the Bible can be tweaked or moved is what they're hiding under. But to come back to the constitutional, that's the spiritual and the scriptural stance. Come back to the constitutional stance, I mean, think about it. They are, again, making law. They should have gone back to Congress and said, if Congress defines, what sex is, then we'll follow that. They're supposed to uphold the law, not make it. And so from the bench in robes, they are, again, making laws. And it's just not their position. From my perspective, it's not their position. And they're hiding under this falsehood. And I think it will have ripples to come.
Yeah. Well, I think you're probably right. And unfortunately, but I do think you're probably right. Now, Peter, there's a very positive case that did come down from the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And it's a case out of Montana where the Supreme Court held that the state's desire to only give assistance, like vouchers or tax credits, to private schools that were secular, non-religious, and exclude those private schools that were religious, that was unconstitutional. They said basically states have the right, Roberts wrote this decision, states have the right to decide if they want to have vouchers or tax credits to support private schools and parental choice. And I love parental choice personally. Right. But they said, but if a state decides to do it, they can't be bigoted and discriminate against those schools that are religious in favor of those schools that are not religious or secular humanist. Right. I think that was a fantastic decision for parental rights, but also from a religious freedom perspective as well. Right. Moving forward, how do you think that this could impact private Christian schools in parts of the country where they're possibly thinking about vouchers and tax credits? Do you think it's more likely or less likely that a state would, in view of this decision, say, let's adopt this, let's go ahead and start vouchers? Or do you think they're going to be less likely to have vouchers moving forward? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, unfortunately, Brad, I think it's going to split down ideological and political lines.
So blue states are going to say be less likely to?
Less likely, and red states more likely. But like, let's say you're sitting at home and you're thinking to yourself, you know what? Yeah, I shouldn't have to pay taxes for my local public schools when my kids are going to a private school and I don't get any tax break or I don't get any voucher or anything like that. And yet, what the court is saying is, well, you're at the mercy of your state. And so I would come back to this, and we've talked about this before, but that's why it's so important to vote in state and city and local elections, because those are the people that really your family's fate and your family's tax credits or vouchers or whatever, they lie in the hands of those politicians that we have put into office, both state, county, and local officials. So I would just say pray for those local officials and those state officials to make the decision not to discriminate against religious schools, as well as the High Court has said.
I know President Trump has been supportive of the concept of vouchers in Washington, D.C. itself. As prior administration actually cut off funding for that.
Right.
For many of these families, inner city families that were not able to afford alternative education, had terrible schools.
Right.
Washington, D.C. government schools are horrific. We could do a whole lecture series on how bad they are.
Yeah.
But it's sort of typical of inner city schools throughout America,
Right.
where we have the greatest discrimination taking place in terms of equal opportunity. You can't, in my opinion, you can't say you're in favor of equal opportunity and equality and tell a child, oh yeah, but from kindergarten through senior in high school through K through 12th grade, we're going to give you an inferior education to those people over here in a higher end neighborhood with better public government schools. And then we're going to maybe give you extra points on your SAT to get into the same college and call it even. Because we have a high dropout rate, because these kids never had the same equal opportunity for a good education. And yet vouchers, it seems to me vouchers are a major resolution of this, considering the fact that government schools and these school districts are not reforming, partly because of the teachers union.
Yeah, and a lot of the other thing is a lot of parents are wanting to homeschool, and a lot of parents are wanting to put their kids in Christian charter school. I think coronavirus has kind of shaken up some of the demographics for education itself, and I think that this is a perfect time for Christian schools and for homeschool co-ops to basically say, hey, listen, we now could actually start receiving some of those credits, and it would be a benefit to everyone who wants to be in private education. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I know something that we've worked on together is actually promoting church homeschool co-ops.
Right.
Church homeschool co-ops. Just explain briefly what we're talking about there, because I think this could be 40% of parents polled, as I understand it, are either decided or leaning towards having their child stay at home next year. Could be because of the virus, whatever reason, but they're staying at home. They're homebound education.
Yeah.
So I see an incredible window for churches to be able to step up and partner with parents in their community, in their church, and start these church homeschool co-ops. What are they? Tell people, they've never heard these before.
Sure.
They maybe there's someone's out there and they say, both of us work, Mom, we both work, yet our kids having to stay home. We don't know what we're going to do, or it's a one-parent family and they can't afford to pay for private schooling.
Right.
How is the church homeschool co-op going to give them the real alternative to do something different than having their child stay at home using government school curriculum with government school standards and the new sex education material, et cetera? Right.
So instead of leaning on the government or resources in the community, you're leaning on your local church. And the church is connecting resources. And so the church is saying, well, there might be a retired, geometry teacher who will come in and teach geometry to all the kids, or, someone is really good with math and she's going to be able to tutor some of the kids in math. It's pooling resources. It's having the kids go to one house for one day. It's having the kids go to the church for Bible class on another day. It's just coming together as families and meeting the needs that we all have. I think it's a really, really good idea. And if you'd like more information about it, just feel free to reach out to me at Pacific Justice.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm really encouraged about it. I've seen pastors are saying this is a no-brainer. I know on our Zoom calls that we have, in fact, we have one tomorrow, Thursday, at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for pastors and church leaders. And we're going to be talking also to private school leaders. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is how they can practically have church homeschool co-ops, but also how they can practically reopen their private schools. Now, let's talk about that.
Right.
Because I know there's a lot of parents out there, and I'm not going to name any that I know, but they're upset because they're being told by their private Christian school that either A, they're not going to reopen and they have to have the kids stay at home and do online the whole time. And for a lot of kids in high school, that's very frustrating.
Right.
They really want that peer-to-peer social interaction.
Yeah.
At that level in adolescence. But then the other thing I'm hearing them say, these schools sending out notices saying, we're going to require every student to wear a mask all day, all school day long, to wear a mask. And some of these parents are saying, I don't want my son or daughter wearing a mask all day, outside, in-store, wherever they are.
Right.
Because health-wise, medically speaking, it's not good for a child.
Right.
And they're not at risk. This virus is no more dangerous to them than the regular flu, according to the statistics.
Right.
So they're trying to figure this one out.
Yeah.
What advice might you give a private Christian school?
Yeah.
You're a parent.
Sure.
You're in touch with the community. What advice do you think it makes sense? Let's assuming that it's legal for them to choose either way. We're not sure by the time the fall comes around. We may have a government edict saying, thus saith Governor Newsom, you must verily do this. But let's say it's just policy. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I first come to the biblical principle that I've quoted before, but that Proverbs 21 says that the horse is prepared for the day of battle. So we have to be somewhat prepared. Having some way of cleaning the desks every day and all of that. So there's certain things we can prepare, but at the very end of the day, safety belongs to the Lord, and we have to trust the Lord with this. Now, knowing that we're trusting the Lord, let's kind of walk through some of the facts. The Hamilton Institute, as well as some studies from the Johns Hopkins University, have deducted that children are way less likely to get the coronavirus than they had anticipated or even previously reported.
And if they get it, they're not likely to die any more than getting the regular flu.
Right. It's a very mild virus when it comes to kids.
So they're not at risk. Those at school are not at risk.
No.
Okay. Little toddlers and infants, there's a little condition, but those at school are not at risk. Okay.
Yeah, and there are some pre-existing conditions and all of that.
Yeah.
But when it comes right down to it, the danger of withholding kids from school, both socially, spiritually, emotionally, all of those have a greater detriment and have greater long-lasting consequences than being exposed to the virus.
Well, like what? Are the kids going to get depressed and have increased suicide, or is that? I guess that would be a logical conclusion, since suicide is actually the number one cause of death for adolescents.
Absolutely, but I'm coming back to, like, for instance, my boys are in elementary school, and my background, is in psychology and counseling, and so, I'm looking at their development, and early childhood development as well as elementary childhood development. They need to be interacting. That's why these homeschool co-ops for churches are so important. If your kids are home all day by themselves every day, it's just not healthy. And so it's important for us to get kids back interacting, learning, growing, developing. They are our future, and we have to treat this with urgency and importance. And so that's what I would tell a parent, that you really have to weigh these things in the balance of common sense and also faith.
Yeah, so it's working together. Now, I like that you say common sense and faith, because there were some pastors initially that when we had the shutdowns and this virus is coming and it's taking over and all, but they said, nope, we're not going to give in. God's going to take care of us. We're going to have church like regular people, and we're not changing anything. Everyone just sit close together, no mask. We're not changing. And some of those pastors have died because of the virus.
Right.
Large members of the church have had the virus. Good numbers have died.
Right.
They became hot spots. So they weren't using common sense.
Right.
So faith plus common sense.
Right.
And we're talking about private Christian schools. I think that requiring children to wear masks all the time, all day, it's medically speaking, it's not good for them. And it causes respiratory inflammation and agitation, and the increased CO2 is not healthy. So I'm thinking you have kids who are not at risk, and you're asking them to do something that is not healthy, that is long-term is going to be harmful to them, particularly if a child, say, has asthma and things like that. I had asthma growing up as a kid in particular, so I'm a little sensitive to that.
Sure.
But then you're also you could also say, well, what if the children have parents who are at risk? Well, parents are generally, who have children in school, they're not in the high-risk group, age-wise. I mean, you may have an Abraham there and a Sarah that, whatever. I mean,
Sure.
it's later in life.
Yeah.
Maybe, not very likely. There may be a grandparent living with them who may be at a higher risk. That child, out of love, can wear a mask if they wish, as a protective element, perhaps. But this is not the norm. This is, and to put all those children at risk, I think is serious and something that we really should examine. And so we're going to be helping private schools, giving them counsel tomorrow on our Zoom call at 2 p.m. And I'm hoping that that private Christian schools across America will take advantage of this. If you know of a private Christian school, leadership at a private Christian school, where they could benefit from this, they're thinking about reopening. Perhaps you've already received a letter or email saying that they're going to just all stay at home, or they're going to have all the kids wear masks. I encourage you to have them on the call. We're going to talk about specific things they can do for, like you said, common sense things they can do to help protect the children, help protect them from liabilities, and at the same time, to understand the real risks involved. If the government doesn't mandate it, and that is the wearing a mask all day, and they force children to wear masks all day, and it's not mandated explicitly as a duty of the school to do this, then that school could be liable for any medical ramifications that take place with those kids in the short term and maybe in the long term. So they need to be very, very careful. And as an attorney, I know we at Pacific Justice Institute want to make them aware so they can act responsibly, as well as in faith, and not allowing fear to cause them to do things that are not the smartest.
And I would just say, having been on some of these calls, there are some things that you guys bring up that you're like, wow, okay, that's something I wouldn't have thought of. And I think one of the calls they talked about, if someone's over 65, maybe they should teach from a distance. Maybe they should teach from online. So just little common sense stuff that I think will be a help. So
yeah, exactly, and very rational, reasonable.
Right.
We want to help people. Yeah. We want to help our society pull through this. We need to be rational, logical, reasonable, and not allow ourselves to be overcome with fear to do things that just don't make sense.
That's right.
And we see it over and over again, and there's definite alternatives for schools to take given different scenarios and situations. Well, Peter, I really appreciate you being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
As serving as our pastor liaison, I know you're helping many pastors and churches across the nation as they deal with these and other issues, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
So folks, there you have it. It's our God-given freedoms we're talking about. Now, let's choose to keep them. I'm Brad Dacus, president of the Pacific Justice Institute. Let's continue the fight for your freedoms.